Value. And today I'm going to talk about assumptions. So you'll find that when you're dealing with life, assumptions are often necessary. It's unavoidable. If you look at any sort of basic logical thinking, you start off with assumptions. You say, I'm going to assume these certain things are true, then I'm going to apply logic, evidence, reason to them and come to a conclusion. But the conclusion is only going to be true if the assumptions are true. So you're not saying this conclusion is definitely true, you're saying, you know, it's as good as my assumptions. So why does this matter? Well, it's important your assumptions are as accurate as possible. Because if you've made a bunch of faulty assumptions, you're going to come to a bunch of faulty conclusions. Even if your reasoning is good, even if you've applied evidence and logic correctly, you've come up with incorrect conclusions, or ones that don't apply to reality, if you've made false assumptions about reality. So I wanted to talk about this. Now, if you're interested in learning the truth about reality and making the best decisions, then you want to have the most accurate assumptions and you want to have the least amount of assumptions. And it's going to depend on the situation, but you have to ask yourself, you know, what am I assuming? Why am I assuming it? So I want to go through some criteria that I think are important. So the first criteria is it necessary to assume this? Okay, so like if I decide that I want to go and walk through that door over there, I'm going to assume that if I try and walk over there, if I use my muscles in the way I've done it before, I assume that's the way that I'm going to go about it, that's going to probably work. That's my assumption. If I don't make that assumption, if I just say, well, I've got no idea how I could get there, and I'm going to start from scratch, what am I doing? I'm wasting time, wasting a lot of time. I've only got a certain amount of time, and you know, from previous experience, it's fairly reasonable to assume that probably the same thing will work again. It's worked that much in the past. So, is it necessary to assume that? I'd say yes, it is. For the rest of my life to function, it's necessary to make that assumption. Give you an example of assumption that's not necessary, and this comes up a lot in religion. People, they'll ask a question, they'll say, who created the universe? And they're making 3 mistakes there. 3 in one question. Okay? 3. The first one, they're making a mistake in language to begin with, because they're saying universe, and in their mind they're probably thinking that means everything, and then they're saying who created everything. So they're already implying there's something not included in everything. So, naughty. I always tend to use the word reality, our reality. Now it could be our reality is the universe, there's nothing else, or it could be there's more stuff that exists in some other way but not in our reality. So using the word universe and sticking to it rather than saying reality is an equivocation fallacy. If you're trying to imply that, you know, it's really everything, instead of it's everything except this special little thing that's also outside it but it's still everything. Yeah, so that's the first mistake. The second mistake is assuming that it needed creating in the first place. It's assuming it hasn't always been here. Why would you assume that? Often it's because people say, well, I can't imagine it any other way, or that's how I've observed things that way. Things always have a beginning and that and the other. Well, that's a fallacy of composition, that you're saying that things inside our reality apply to reality itself. You know, that you can just extrapolate the rules. Well, no, that's very unreliable. And also, no, we've noticed that energy tends to be conserved. You know, that has been our observations. So things aren't coming out of nowhere. It's just energy changing forms. So, you know, our observations don't indicate that energy is or things are coming out of nowhere. So no, you know, it doesn't even back up with observations. But either way, we've got no fucking idea. You know, beyond a certain point, science gets to a certain point, we don't know what happened. just saying, oh well, it's obvious, I can ignore everything scientists know, don't care how complicated it is, I'm just going to say that blah blah blah. No, you're making an assumption. Maybe our reality had a beginning, whatever that might mean, or maybe it didn't. We don't know. There's no need to make that assumption. The third mistake is that assuming that there is a beginning is you're using the word who. Who made it? You're assuming it's an intelligence and not just some random act. You know, it just happened. Just broke off some other reality. Just popped out of, out of nowhere. We don't know. We don't know if it had a beginning, and if it did, we don't know if there's intelligence behind it or not. So you see how you're making 3 mistakes in just that one question. So you have to be careful, because you've cut off vast amounts of possibilities just by asking that question. And if you don't stop and think about it, you realise you're never going to get anywhere. So by making those assumptions, they're not necessary assumptions. You don't need to assume that reality had a beginning. It doesn't help you in any way. It's only you're assuming it because that's what you want your conclusion to be or want it to be based on. Okay, so we've got necessary. The next criteria is danger of making the assumption. How dangerous is it to assume this? What are the consequences if you're wrong? Now, if I assume that me walking over to the door over there and I do it the way I've always done it before, is that a dangerous assumption? What's the consequences if I'm wrong? Well, I'd say that there isn't any. If I tried to do it and it didn't work, what's the consequences? Nothing. I haven't lost anything. Obviously it's going to indicate there's some sort of problem, something I don't understand. But I haven't caused a problem, any serious harm or anything. I mean, what's the consequences of assuming the universe had a beginning? Well, I covered it already. By making that assumption, you're cutting off like huge swathes of possibilities and narrowing down to hypothetical situations. So you could have just ignored what is the truth, and you're studying what is actually redundant. You might be studying what's true, but you don't know. You don't know what, because you just cut a load of it off and say, no, for whatever reason, no, I'm assuming that isn't the case. So you could have blocked, your ability to study the subject accurately. And obviously, if you make more and more assumptions about God and all this, and what God wants, the more assumptions you make, the more dangerous that becomes. Because if you start living your life according to those rules, and those rules are bollocks, and are completely wrong, then that is dangerous. You're making your life decisions based on these rules. So it's important these rules, these assumptions are accurate. So it is dangerous, especially when it involves how you treat other people. If you treat them less favourably, or even you treat yourself less favourably, and you feel guilty about things, or you do things just because you think God wants you to do them or whatever. You're wasting time, energy, resources. You're making bad decisions. So there is danger involved. And the last criteria is self-correcting. Is this an assumption that's going to show itself to be false? If it is false, or is it likely to? So again, me going over to the door, if it's false, I'll find out like almost immediately. Be like, oh, well, I'd assumed this would work, but it hasn't worked. So I found out straight away it hasn't worked. What the fuck? So it's self-correcting. Straight away I can go, right, okay, what's the problem? I can find another approach. So, it's necessary and pragmatic to make that assumption in the first place, but it's corrected itself. Now what do I do? It's the same way with most assumptions you make like that. You assume things are going to work the way that they've always worked. It's just, if you tried to act any other way, you would just be paralysed. You wouldn't be able to do anything. And all these things are self-correcting. But if you go back to the God thing, no, it's not going to be self-correcting, because these things aren't evidence-based. They're not reason-based. They're assumption-based. So you're never going to find out if they're true or not, because, they didn't come from evidence in the first place. And, that's the argument for ignorance. You can't prove it isn't true. No, you can't. Exactly. So if it's wrong, you're never going to find out it's wrong. So that, again, makes it even more dangerous. So, the assumptions you want to make ideally, in my opinion, necessary, of minimal danger, and self-correcting. In that case, that's just the most sensible way to go about it. If you're making any more assumptions than that, you need to think about whether they're justified and whether they should be things you should discard.